The ice-crusted Delaware River stretched before them like a death trap, its jagged chunks grinding against the hull of Washington's boat as the oars cut through the bitter darkness of December 25th, 1776. General George Washington stood at the bow, his weathered face set in grim determination as he watched his ragged Continental Army struggle across the treacherous waters. Behind him, nearly 2,400 men, many barefoot, leaving bloody tracks in the snow, prepared for what could be their final gamble. The American Revolution was dying. After a series of devastating defeats in New York, Washington's army had dwindled to a shadow of its former strength. Enlistments were set to expire in just 6 days, and with them, any hope of independence. The British forces under General William Howe controlled most of the major cities, while Hessian mercenaries occupied strategic positions throughout New Jersey. Public support for the revolution was crumbling faster than the ice beneath their feet. Washington knew that a single victory could resurrect the cause, but failure would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The crossing itself was a masterpiece of desperate courage, men hauling 18 artillery pieces across a river that should have been impassable. Colonel Alexander Hamilton, barely 20 years old, supervised the loading of cannons while his breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The password for the night was victory or death, words that carried more weight than mere military protocol. As the last boat touched the Pennsylvania shore, Washington received troubling intelligence from his network of spies. The Hessian garrison at Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, had grown complacent after weeks of minor skirmishes. They celebrated Christmas with Germanic thoroughness, drinking heavily and posting minimal guards. But Trenton was only the beginning of Washington's audacious plan. Captain Alexander Graydon, writing in his memoirs years later, would describe this moment as the pivot upon which the fate of America turned. The crossing had taken 9 hours longer than planned, but by dawn on December 26th, Washington's force was moving through the snow-covered forests of New Jersey, their muskets wrapped in cloth to keep the powder dry. The surprise attack on Trenton succeeded beyond Washington's wildest hopes. The Hessians, caught completely off guard, surrendered after a brief but fierce battle. Nearly 1,000 prisoners were taken, along with critical supplies and artillery. But Washington understood that one victory, however spectacular, would not be enough to save the revolution. Intelligence reports soon confirmed his fears. British General Lord Cornwallis was racing back from New York with a force of 8,000 men, determined to crush the American army before it could escape back across the Delaware. Washington faced an impossible choice: retreat and lose the momentum of victory, or stand and fight against overwhelming odds. It was then that Washington conceived a plan so audacious that his own officers initially believed he had lost his mind. Instead of retreating or making a desperate stand at Trenton, he would march his exhausted army through the frozen night to attack the British garrison at Princeton, 12 miles away. The maneuver would require perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and incredible luck. The campfires of Trenton burned low as Washington's army prepared for what many believed would be their final march. On the night of January 2nd, 1777, as Lord Cornwallis settled into his quarters just miles away, confident that morning would bring the destruction of the Continental Army, Washington set his desperate plan in motion. According to historical accounts preserved in the Princeton Battlefield Society archives, the American army consisted of 4,600 men, a number that included many Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia who had rallied to Washington's banner after the stunning victory at Trenton. But beneath the surface optimism, the situation remained precarious. Many of the Continental soldiers had agreed to extend their enlistments for just 6 more weeks, and desertion continued to plague the ranks. The night march began at 1 o'clock in the morning, with Washington dividing his force into 2 columns. General Hugh Mercer would lead one wing along the Quaker Road, while Washington himself would take the main force along a longer but safer route. The temperature had dropped well below freezing, and the roads were treacherous with ice and snow. Men wrapped their feet in rags and blankets, leaving a trail of blood that marked their passage through the darkness. Captain John Fitzgerald, Washington's aide-de-camp, later wrote that the march seemed more like a funeral procession than an army advancing to battle. The wheels of the artillery pieces were wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound, and strict orders forbade any conversation above a whisper every few miles. Washington would ride back along the column, checking on his men and ensuring that no one had fallen behind. As dawn approached, the exhausted army found themselves just 2 miles from Princeton. The British garrison, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, consisted of approximately 1,200 men from the 17th, 40th, and 55th Regiments of Foot. These were not foreign mercenaries like the Hessians at Trenton, but seasoned British regulars who had fought in campaigns across the globe. Washington's plan called for a coordinated attack from multiple directions. But as so often happens in war, the reality proved far more chaotic than the strategy. As Mercer's column advanced along the Quaker Road, they encountered Hessian outposts that had fled Trenton and were now retreating toward Princeton. A brief firefight erupted, alerting the British garrison to the American approach. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, an experienced officer who had served in the French and Indian War, quickly grasped the situation. Instead of remaining in Princeton's defensive positions, he made the bold decision to march out and engage the Americans in open battle. His two regiments formed up with parade ground precision, their redcoats brilliant against the snow-covered landscape. The first clash came in William Clark's Orchard, where Mercer's men encountered Mawhood's advance guard. The fighting was fierce and personal, with bayonets and musket butts replacing formal volleys as the lines collided. General Mercer, a Scottish-born physician who had served with Washington during the French and Indian War, found himself surrounded by British soldiers, who mistook him for Washington himself due to his similar build and gray hair. Mercer fell with 7 bayonet wounds, but managed to crawl to safety behind a large oak tree that still stands on the Princeton battlefield today. His men, seeing their beloved general struck down, began to waver. The carefully planned attack was dissolving into confusion as British discipline seemed poised to triumph over American determination once again. The sound of musket fire crackling through the frozen morning air reached Washington's ears. As he led the main column toward Princeton through the bare winter trees, he could see the flash of bayonets and the distinctive red coats of British regulars locked in combat with Mercer's brigade. The American line was bending, and in some places breaking entirely, as panic began to spread through the ranks. This was the moment that would define not just the battle, but Washington's entire legacy as a military commander. Instead of directing the fight from a safe distance, as most generals of his era would have done, Washington spurred his horse directly toward the heaviest fighting. Captain John Fitzgerald, riding beside his commander, later recalled watching in amazement as the normally reserved Virginia planter transformed into something resembling a force of nature. "Follow me," Washington shouted, his voice carrying across the battlefield despite the din of combat. He rode directly between the opposing lines, so close to the British muskets that Fitzgerald covered his eyes, certain he was about to witness the death of the American cause. The moment stretched like an eternity. British soldiers raised their weapons. American troops who had been retreating suddenly stopped and turned back toward the fight. According to the detailed account preserved in the New Jersey Historical Society records, what happened next became the stuff of legend. Washington's presence on the battlefield had an almost supernatural effect on his men. Soldiers who had been running in terror suddenly found their courage, while others who had never seen their commander in the heat of battle were inspired by his fearless example. The tide of combat shifted with dramatic suddenness. American troops who had been scattered by the British bayonet charge reformed their lines and delivered a devastating volley at point-blank range. The crack of hundreds of muskets firing in unison echoed across the Princeton battlefield like thunder, and when the smoke cleared, the British advance had been stopped cold. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, watching his disciplined regiments crumble under the renewed American assault, made the difficult decision to sound the retreat. His men fell back toward Princeton in good order, but they were clearly shaken by the intensity of the American counterattack. For the first time in the war, British regulars had been decisively beaten in open field combat by colonial forces. Captain Alexander Hamilton, commanding a battery of artillery, later described the scene as the most sublime spectacle I have ever witnessed. His cannons, positioned on high ground overlooking the battlefield, poured devastating fire into the retreating British columns. The young officer, who would later become the first Secretary of the Treasury, showed the same tactical brilliance that had marked the crossing of the Delaware. The fighting around Princeton itself proved brief, but decisive. The British garrison, already weakened by Mawhood's decision to march out and fight in the open, could not withstand the momentum of Washington's assault. American troops poured into the town from 3 different directions, capturing supplies, weapons, and prisoners with minimal resistance. But Washington understood that victory would be meaningless if he allowed his army to be trapped by Cornwallis's approaching force. Even as his men celebrated their triumph, he was already planning the next phase of his campaign. The British would expect him to retreat back across the Delaware, but Washington had a different idea, one that would keep his army in the field and continue to threaten British positions throughout New Jersey. The Battle of Princeton was over, but its consequences were just beginning to unfold across the 13 colonies. As Washington's army departed Princeton in the early afternoon of January 3rd, 1777, they left behind more than just a defeated British garrison. The psychological impact of their victory would reverberate through both armies and reach the highest levels of government in London and Paris. What had begun as a desperate gamble was rapidly transforming into something far more significant than a simple military triumph. The British command structure, which had grown increasingly confident following their victories in New York, suddenly found itself questioning fundamental assumptions about the war. General William Howe, comfortable in his winter quarters in New York City, received news of the Princeton defeat with incredulous disbelief. According to dispatches preserved in the British National Archives, Howe initially suspected the reports were exaggerated or entirely false. Lord Cornwallis, who had been within hours of crushing Washington's army at Trenton, now faced the humiliating reality that his quarry had not only escaped, but had inflicted another stinging defeat on His Majesty's forces. The psychological effect on British morale was immediate and profound. Officers who had dismissed the Continental Army as a rabble of farmers and tradesmen were forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that they were fighting a genuinely formidable opponent. The impact on American morale proved even more dramatic. News of the twin victories at Trenton and Princeton spread through the colonies with remarkable speed, carried by riders who galloped from town to town with tales that grew more heroic with each retelling. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress, which had fled the city in panic just weeks earlier, began to return as confidence in Washington's leadership was restored. According to contemporary accounts published in the Pennsylvania Gazette, recruitment offices that had stood empty for months suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with volunteers. Men who had dismissed the revolution as a lost cause now saw genuine hope for independence. The victories demonstrated that British forces were not invincible, and that American determination could triumph over European military professionalism. Perhaps most importantly, the battles transformed Washington himself from a general on the verge of defeat into a national hero. His personal courage at Princeton, riding between the lines while musket balls whistled around him, became the subject of countless letters, diary entries, and newspaper accounts. The image of the Virginia planter fearlessly leading his men into battle captured the imagination of a people desperate for symbols of hope and courage. The strategic implications extended far beyond American borders. In Paris, French Foreign Minister Charles Gravier, Comte de Vergennes, received detailed reports of the Princeton victory with growing interest. France had been quietly supporting the American cause with supplies and weapons, but had hesitated to commit to full military alliance. The demonstration that American forces could defeat British regulars in open combat suggested that the rebellion might actually succeed. Benjamin Franklin, serving as American ambassador to France, skillfully exploited the psychological impact of Princeton to advance his diplomatic mission. His letters to potential French allies emphasized not just the military significance of the victories, but their demonstration of American resolve and capability. The battles provided concrete evidence that American independence was a realistic possibility, rather than a romantic fantasy. The effect on British public opinion proved equally significant. London newspapers, which had been confidently predicting the imminent collapse of the rebellion, were forced to acknowledge that the war would be longer and more costly than initially anticipated. Members of Parliament who had supported the conflict began to question whether the expense and casualties would justify the ultimate victory. Washington understood that he had achieved something far more valuable than tactical success. He had fundamentally altered the psychological landscape of the war. In the days following Princeton, as Washington led his exhausted but victorious army toward winter quarters in Morristown, the full genius of his strategy began to reveal itself. The twin victories had accomplished something that months of traditional military maneuvering could never have achieved. They had fundamentally shifted the balance of power. In the northern theater of the war, the immediate strategic benefits were obvious to anyone with military experience. Washington had captured nearly 1,500 enemy soldiers, along with vital supplies, weapons, and artillery pieces that his army desperately needed. The seizure of these materials provided the Continental Army with resources that would sustain them through the remainder of the winter campaign. But the deeper strategic implications would take weeks to fully manifest. British forces throughout New Jersey, which had been comfortably established in winter quarters from Princeton to New Brunswick, suddenly found their positions untenable. The lightning strikes at Trenton and Princeton had demonstrated that no British outpost was safe from American attack. Garrison commanders who had grown complacent during weeks of peaceful occupation now faced the terrifying reality that Washington's army could appear anywhere, at any time. General Howe was forced to completely reorganize his defensive strategy. According to military correspondence preserved in the William Clements Library at the University of Michigan, British forces were withdrawn from dozens of outposts across New Jersey, consolidating into heavily fortified positions around New Brunswick and Perth Amboy. This strategic retreat effectively ceded control of most of New Jersey back to American forces. The psychological warfare aspect of Washington's victories proved even more devastating than the immediate military consequences. British and Hessian soldiers, who had entered winter quarters confident in their superiority over colonial forces, now lived in constant fear of surprise attack. Morale plummeted as stories of the Princeton battle spread through the ranks, often growing more dramatic with each retelling. Captain Johann Ewald, a Hessian officer whose detailed diary provides one of the most complete contemporary accounts of the campaign, wrote that his men started at every shadow and sound in the night. The reputation for invincibility that European professional armies had cultivated over centuries of warfare had been shattered by a force they had dismissed as amateur soldiers playing at war. Washington's decision to establish winter quarters at Morristown rather than retreating across the Delaware proved to be another strategic masterstroke. The New Jersey Highlands provided excellent defensive terrain, while keeping his army positioned to threaten British communications and supply lines. From Morristown, American forces could strike at British outposts throughout the region while remaining secure from large-scale counterattack. The location also served important political purposes. By keeping his army in New Jersey rather than retreating to Pennsylvania, Washington demonstrated to both allies and enemies that American forces were capable of maintaining territory they had liberated. The visible presence of Continental troops encouraged local patriots while discouraging loyalist activities throughout the region. International implications of the Princeton victory continued to develop throughout the winter months. French observers, who had been cautiously optimistic about American prospects following the Trenton success, became genuinely enthusiastic about the possibility of full military alliance. After Princeton, the demonstration that American forces could not only surprise an enemy garrison, but could also defeat British regulars in conventional battle provided the evidence that French military advisors needed to recommend direct intervention. Spanish authorities in New Orleans and Havana also took note of the American victories, seeing potential opportunities to strike at British interests in the Caribbean and Gulf regions. The global nature of the conflict that would eventually emerge from Washington's winter campaign was already beginning to take shape in diplomatic correspondence between European capitals. Washington himself understood that he had achieved something unprecedented in the history of colonial rebellions. He had proven that irregular forces could not only survive against professional European armies, but could actually defeat them under the right circumstances. The winter months following Princeton witnessed a transformation that extended far beyond military strategy or diplomatic maneuvering. In taverns and meeting houses from Boston to Savannah, ordinary Americans began to tell and retell the story of Washington's crossing and the battles that followed. With each telling, the events took on mythic proportions that would eventually become foundational to American national identity. The figure of Washington himself evolved from a respected Virginia planter into something approaching a folk hero. Stories of his courage at Princeton, riding his white horse between the opposing battle lines while musket balls whistled around him, captured the imagination of a people desperate for symbols of hope and strength. Captain Fitzgerald's account of covering his eyes, certain he was about to witness Washington's death, became a standard feature of these tales. Contemporary newspapers played a crucial role in amplifying the psychological impact of the victories. The Pennsylvania Journal published detailed accounts that emphasized not just the military success, but the almost supernatural leadership that Washington had displayed. These articles were reprinted in newspapers throughout the colonies, creating a shared narrative of American triumph over seemingly impossible odds. According to research published in the Journal of the American Revolution, the Princeton victory marked a crucial turning point in how ordinary colonists viewed their prospects for independence. Prior to the winter campaign, support for the Revolution had been declining steadily as British victories mounted. Polls conducted by colonial newspapers suggested that as many as half of all Americans had begun to favor reconciliation with Britain rather than continued warfare. The twin victories fundamentally altered this dynamic. Recruitment, which had virtually ceased in many areas, resumed with remarkable vigor. Men who had dismissed the Continental Army as a lost cause now enlisted with enthusiasm, bringing stories of Washington's heroism from their home communities. The army that emerged from winter quarters at Morristown was not only larger, but fundamentally different in character from the force that had crossed the Delaware just months earlier. The impact on American women proved particularly significant, though often overlooked in traditional military histories. Letters and diary entries from the period reveal that women throughout the colonies saw Washington's victories as validation of their own sacrifices and contributions to the cause. The image of the commander-in-chief risking everything for the principle of independence resonated deeply with women who had been managing farms, businesses, and households while their men served in the army. Abigail Adams, writing to her husband, John, captured this sentiment perfectly. The general has shown that American virtue can triumph over European vice. His example gives hope to all who labor for the cause of liberty. Similar sentiments appeared in correspondence between women throughout the colonies, creating a network of support that would prove crucial to sustaining the war effort through its darkest moments. The religious implications of the victories also contributed to their legendary status. Many Americans saw the hand of divine providence in Washington's seemingly miraculous escape from destruction at Trenton and his subsequent triumph at Princeton. Sermons preached throughout the colonies drew parallels between Washington's leadership and biblical accounts of deliverance from overwhelming enemies. Reverend John Witherspoon, president of the College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, delivered a sermon just weeks after the battle in which he declared that the Almighty has raised up General Washington as an instrument of His will to secure the blessings of liberty for this chosen people. Such religious interpretations gave the military victories a spiritual dimension that resonated deeply with colonial audiences. The international community also began to take notice of what was happening in America. European newspapers, which had largely ignored the colonial rebellion as a minor disturbance, suddenly began providing detailed coverage of Washington's campaigns. The victories suggested that the American conflict might develop into something far more significant than a simple colonial uprising. As spring approached in 1777, the true magnitude of what Washington had accomplished during those 10 crucial days began to reveal itself. The Battle of Princeton and its immediate predecessor at Trenton had done far more than simply provide military victories. They had fundamentally altered the trajectory of the American Revolution and laid the psychological foundation for what would eventually become the United States of America. The strategic situation had been completely transformed. British forces, which had controlled most of New Jersey just weeks earlier, now found themselves confined to heavily fortified enclaves around New York City and a few coastal strongholds. The initiative in the Northern Theater had passed decisively to American forces, a shift that would influence British planning for the remainder of the war. General Howe, writing to his superiors in London, acknowledged that the winter campaign had materially altered our prospects for bringing this rebellion to a speedy conclusion. His dispatches, preserved in the British National Archives, reveal a growing recognition that the conflict would require far more resources and time than initially anticipated. The comfortable assumption that colonial resistance would collapse with the first serious military pressure had been shattered by Washington's audacious winter offensive. The diplomatic consequences proved even more far-reaching than the immediate military results. French Foreign Minister Vergennes, who had been providing covert support to the Americans while maintaining official neutrality, began serious preparations for open military alliance. The demonstration at Princeton that American forces could defeat British regulars in conventional battle provided the evidence that French military advisors needed to recommend direct intervention. Benjamin Franklin, working tirelessly in Paris to secure French support, found his task immeasurably easier. After Princeton, The victory provided concrete proof that American independence was achievable, rather than merely desirable. His letters to potential allies emphasized that France was being offered the opportunity to join a winning cause rather than being asked to rescue a failing rebellion. The psychological transformation within America itself proved to be Washington's most important achievement. The victories had created a shared national narrative of triumph over seemingly impossible odds. This story became a crucial component of emerging American identity, providing a foundation myth that would sustain the nation through future crises and challenges, according to historical analysis published by the Smithsonian Institution. The Princeton victory marked the moment when the American Revolution transformed from a political rebellion into a genuine war of independence with realistic prospects for success. The battle demonstrated that American forces could not only survive against professional European armies, but could actually outfight them under the right circumstances. The legend of Washington himself, born during those crucial winter weeks, would eventually transcend military achievement to become a cornerstone of American political culture. The image of the commander-in-chief risking everything for the principle of liberty provided a powerful symbol that would influence American leadership ideals for generations to come. The Battle of Princeton also established important precedents for American military doctrine. Washington's emphasis on mobility, surprise, and unconventional tactics would become hallmarks of American military strategy. Throughout the nation's history, the willingness to take enormous risks for strategic advantage, demonstrated so dramatically during the Delaware Crossing and Princeton campaign, became a defining characteristic of American military leadership. Perhaps most importantly, the victories validated the revolutionary ideals that had been articulated in the Declaration of Independence just months earlier. The success at Princeton proved that the principles of liberty and self-governance were worth fighting for and could be successfully defended against the greatest military power of the age. As Washington led his army out of winter quarters that spring, he commanded not just a military force, but the embodiment of a new nation's aspiration. The Battle of Princeton had been far more than a military victory. It had been the birth announcement of the United States of America, delivered with cannon fire and musket volleys on a frozen New Jersey battlefield. The Revolution would continue for 6 more years, with many darker moments and greater challenges ahead. But the foundation had been laid during those 10 crucial days. In the winter of 1776 and 1777, when a desperate gamble by a Virginia planter became the cornerstone of American independence.